All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to today's webinar, Managed Care Organizational Self-Assessment Report, Interpreting the Results. My name is Brianna Gonsalves. I'm with the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, and I'm joined today by Patricia Quintero. We're going to talk to you today about the Organizational Self-Assessment Individual Results Report that you received last week. So before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. The first is how to use the WebEx system today. Many of you have already been on webinars with us in the past, so I'll just quickly review some of the key functionalities. Upon joining today's webinar, you have been placed on mute, so please submit any questions that you have via the chat box feature. If it is not activated on the right side of your screen, you can activate that by clicking the dialog bubble that appears right below the presentation slides if you just wave your mouse over the presentation slides. We will also be collecting questions throughout the duration of the webinar, but we will be addressing them at the very end of today's presentation. So the other thing I want to mention, please make your organizational individualized report readily available. We'll be discussing that and we'll be going through the details of that. I also want to let folks know that the slides will be posted to our website in a hidden page because this is a very small targeted group of providers we are working with here. So we will distribute that and send out an email with the direct link to that page in 2 to 3 business days. And again, if you have questions that come up, please feel free to email us at mctac.info@nyu.edu after the webinar. And just as a reminder, the information and timelines are current as of the day of the presentation, today, November 8th. So just a brief overview of the presentation today. We're going to quickly provide some high-level introduction to this work that we've been doing together over the past few months. We're going to dive into the Managed Care Organizational Self-Assessment results. We're going to look at the agency benchmark report, and we'll discuss upcoming events and next steps. So you are all here today because you have been identified as a critical access provider. This is a group of 43 providers that we are going to continue to work with over the next few months to provide some really targeted technical assistance efforts. So over the next few months, we'll be working with you to really think about your strategic plans, work through those, identify key activities and areas to really apply the funding for critical access providers. And just as a reminder, here are the key deliverables for the critical access providers. We've already completed step 1, the Managed Care Organizational Self-Assessment. So thank you again, everyone, for submitting those. You have all received your report at this point, and if you have not received your report, please also email us at mctac.info@nyu.edu, and we will make sure that you have that readily available. The next key deliverable for this group of providers is to participate in focused MCTAC and state trainings during the month of November. These are mandatory state trainings, so please sign up for them. You have received an email with the list of dates and locations. We will be visiting Syracuse, Buffalo, Saratoga, and New York City. And Tarrytown. I was wondering where my number 5 went. So yes, so we have 5 locations. We're actually offering 6 trainings, and we'll get into those details in just a second. So please register for those. We will then, the third key deliverable is to complete and submit strategic transition plan, which we will be diving into during our in-person events. And then the fourth is to complete tasks and activities associated with your MIC OSA and strategic transition plan to prepare for the transition to managed care. So here is our timeline and next offerings. Again, these in-person events are mandatory offerings. We will be having our first event in Tarrytown on Friday, November 16th. Then we will be traveling the state and ending on November 30th in New York City. I want to highlight here that there are two different training offerings in New York City, so a morning offering and an afternoon offering. If you are in the New York City area, you do not have to attend both. We just wanted to provide two times for our New York City providers and Long Island providers so that they're able to have some flexibility. And then the deadline for the strategic transition plan submission is December 30th. And just to highlight one last time, MCTAC's role throughout this project has been to really work with providers on the managed care organizational self-assessment, and now we're moving into the technical assistance stage of our work together. So we're going to continue to coordinate and develop in-person and web-based offerings to really address some of those areas of targeted need that have come through in the results of the managed care organizational self-assessment. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Patricia Quintero, who is going to really give us a good overview of the assessment and the individualized reports that you all have received.
Great. Thank you, Brianna. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today and to be speaking with you. Like Brianna said, my name is Patricia. I am the Assistant Director for Analytics and Evaluation for MCTAC. And I had the pleasure of working really closely on this data set. So we'll get deeper into the details and your assessment and what that means, but we're just going to do a quick overview of how we got here. So as you all know, we had the MIC OSA submitted to you all through email and through Qualtrics. Once we received all of the the data from the 43 participants, we did create an analysis. This was for both ends. This is to analyze the data at an aggregate level and to see how we create that targeted technical assistance and what topics are going to be of utmost importance. And secondly, to create these individual reports so that you as an agency can self-identify and figure out what are your key ideas and areas where you might have some deficits or need to tweaking up and help build your own strategic transition plan, which I know is a deliverable for this contract. So let's talk about the organizational self-assessment. Once again, an organizational self-assessment is based on a tool. It's based on the self-reported information that you provided, and it's supposed to give you a good indication of where you are right now before you undergo a large transition, such as this transition to managed care. Specifically for the topic of transition care, we had 11 domains, and like I said, this for your individual reports, it's supposed to provide a snapshot of where you are right now, what are the areas that you're doing great in, and what are the areas that you're going to need to prioritize in order to effectively transition. So this is a copy or a sample of the benchmark tool. Before we go in and you look at your individual reports, we're going to go field by field. We're going to help define, but you should have received something that looks like this. If you did not receive it, ask within your organization. We sent out these reports based on the information that was provided to us. So at the end of the assessment, there was an email. We said, please provide the email to which this report should be sent to. If there were any changes, like Brianna said, please contact us and we would be happy to resend that to you since it is so critical for next steps. Okay, perfect. So before we get in, we're going to start looking at these reports. This is a good opportunity to pull up your report. I think that anytime that you're looking at data, people tend to get a little intimidated, or someone might interpret one thing as one thing or another, and that tends to be because sometimes these terms have different operational definitions. So before we go into what column means, I want everyone to get on the same page as to what each field means. So within the agency report, you're going to see a number of columns. The first column that we'll be talking about is the score range, which means that in each domain, there was a variety or a difference in the number of points, the maximum number of points that you could have achieved depending on the results and what you submitted. So some ranges are smaller than others, whereas some ranges are significantly larger. So I know finance was a really large field, so on and so forth. The average score, that is the score of your cohort. So we took the 43 results and we ran what that average was, and we'll be using that as a benchmark for your score. The agency score that is your agency's individual score. So you will see what your individual score is for each of the 11 domains and at the end as a total. And then the percentile, this can be a little confusing. It's not percentage. It is a percentage, but not the actual percentage that we know, like on a test, like 100% or something like that. It's the percentage of agency scoring less than your score. And so that will vary, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Okay. So now we're going to go into each of the domain scores. So here you will see this lovely table. It talks about each of the 11 domains. What was the name of the domain? What was the score range? So how many points you could have been awarded by each domain? And then what was the average score? So that's something to take into consideration. And like I said, the average score is going to be your benchmark. So what number do you use to rule against your scores from? So going into each of the domains, when we talk about understanding Medicaid managed care plans, MMCs, the priorities, and present managed care involvement, there were 3 points max, and the average was 2.7. In contracting, we had four potential points. The average score was 3.2, so that was rather high. In communication and reporting, there was 4 points available, and the average score was 2.8. IT system was a very large domain, given our experience with the transition to managed care. So there were 27 potential points, and the average score was 20.2. Then we have medical necessity, there were 19 points. The average score was 12.1. Member services, there were 7 points available. The average score was 3.8. Then we speak about the interface with physical health, social support, and health homes. The potential range was 13 points, and the average score was 11, so that's another high domain overall for the group. Then we talk about quality management, quality studies, and incentives. That score range was rather small. There was only 4 points available. The average score was 3.2. Finance and billing was the largest domain overall. There were 43 points available based on the number and the weight of each of the scores. And the average score was 27.7, so not shabby. Then we have access requirements. There were 8 points available, and the average score was 5.3. Then the last one, which was data management and evaluation capacity, there were 13 points available, and the average score was 8. In total, each agency could have scored anywhere from 100 to 145 points, and the average overall score for the 43 participating agencies was 100. So now we're going to go and get your report. So if you have it, pull it up on the screen or have a printout next to it so you can write notes, and we're going to go one by one through the fields. So at the top, you'll see there's the definitions that we had already described. So make sure to use that as if this is the first time you're looking at it, if you want to speak with your team, make sure to use that. So you'll see the domains. The second column is the average score, and that was what we just discussed. Remember again, that's your benchmark score. Right next to it, you'll see your agency score, which we'll be going over next. So this is your agency score. We individually scored and reviewed each of the scores to validate them. So you'll be wanting to compare. That is the most important column. You're going to want to look at that and compare it to the average score immediately to its left. And the last column is percentile. Remember, that was the percentage of agencies that scored less than you per domain and overall. Something that we want to take into account is if you see that number and you're a little worried about that number in particular, like I said, the most important number that you should be using as a benchmark is that average score. Something to take into consideration with percentile is that it was a very small cohort overall. So when there were a large number of people with the same average, that can kind of skew those numbers. So like I said, when you're explaining this to your CEO, your board, whoever it may be, explain the importance to them of that benchmark score being the average, and how you can use that to disseminate. So now that you have a better understanding of the report, my next steps or recommendations would be to look at that and highlight for your agency specifically, what are the domains that you could strengthen, and I think that'll play a big part in your next steps. Okay, just some important information that we're just going to reiterate for the purpose of transparency is that each agency submitted a survey based on self-report. And once again, the benchmarking tool is only based on this population, and it's only based on the agencies that completed the assessment. So this is not some golden standard. This is based on your cohort moving together over time. That can change as you continue to grow capacity and effectiveness towards this transition to managed care.
Great. Thank you so much, Patricia, for walking us through the individual report. I want to bring up the timeline and next offerings again to highlight a few things. Again, that these are mandatory events, but also that we will be utilizing the information that we have pulled from the managed care organizational self-assessments, the aggregate data, as well as the individual data, to really pull out some key areas that we want to continue to support providers on and offer some targeted technical assistance. So these in-person offerings will really be great opportunities to really think through these key areas and work with this provider cohort to consider best practices, begin a dialogue, and really begin to consider some of the suggestions and recommendations that we can provide to you as you work through your strategic transition plan to the transition to managed care. So with that, we are going to turn it over to the question and answer section of today's presentation. We anticipate that providers have some questions about their individual reports, so please feel free to submit your questions through the chat box, and we will address them. We will certainly leave as much time as needed for the questions that are coming through. Okay. So our first question is a request to resend the list of trainings and dates and locations to providers. So we will certainly do that. So everyone will should anticipate to see an email in their inbox very soon with just a reminder of the trainings, the dates, and locations, as well as registration links.
Brianna, is there a certain email that people should be bookmarking so that when announcements like that come through, it doesn't get lost in spam or trash or something like that?
That's a good question. So mctac.info@nyu.edu is the email that we do send our announcements from. It's often spelled out as MCTAC, so you might not see the mctac.info@nyu.edu as your sender, but just the name MCTAC. Okay. Thanks, Patricia.
Yep.
So again, if you don't see the chat box activated on your right-hand side, you can just move your mouse right over the presentation slides, and you'll see that there's a circular button with a dialog bubble, and that will activate your chat functionality on the right-hand side of your screen. So our next question that we have received is, will the in-person trainings provide assistance with the strategic plan development? And absolutely. So we'll spend a great deal of time during our in-person training going over the strategic transition plan and how you can really begin to think about identifying activities to put onto your transition plan. I'm just going to move us to the next slide while we wait for other questions to come through. I just want to highlight here our MCTAC.info account, as well as our website, mctacny.org. That's a really great resource as you walk through each of the areas of the individualized report, and you can explore and browse some of our trainings to begin to think about ways to address some of the gaps that you are beginning to see in your reports. So we'll give folks a few more minutes.
There's another question.
Okay. We have received another question. Can you let folks know how to, okay, so if you have not received the strategic plan template, please contact either mctac.info@nyu.edu or the OMH help email, and they will be able to also provide you with the strategic plan template.
Yes, please provide your agency name and any information or emails that it should be sent to, and we'll be happy to send that over.
All right, well, we'll wait one more minute, see if anyone has any last-minute questions. But again, if anything comes up, please do not hesitate to contact us, mctac.info@nyu.edu with any other questions. Okay. The next question we have received, is it possible to also see the details within each domain?
At this point, we will not be providing the detail or the breakdown of the scoring for each of the domains. The way that we have scored it is this should be representative of, as a whole. And, you know, more details that will help answer each of those questions of those domains as to best protocols and best practices. I know that those will be addressed in the training sessions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Patricia. Another question that has come in, what topics will the in-person meetings cover? So based on the results from the OSA, we will be covering medical necessity, eligibility criteria, and practices. We will also review member service and grievance procedures. We will also spend time discussing finance and billing, as well as data management and evaluation and capacity. So you can expect to have conversations around those 4 specific domains during the in-person trainings. But again, as I mentioned before, we'll be having some extensive conversations about the strategic transition plan as well, really opening up dialogue amongst our provider community to really discuss best practices and ideas in really developing the strategic transition plan. Okay, and I think with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Here is our email address once again and our website, so please feel free to use us and the website as a resource moving forward. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Patricia for taking the time to walk us through the individual report, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. So have a great rest of your afternoon.
Yep, we look forward to seeing you at the live trainings.